Today, Triumph announced their 2023 update to the super popular middleweight roadster, the Street Triple. And there's plenty to get stuck into here with updates to the engine, the tech, the visuals, as well as a new super spec Moto2 limited edition. So in this video, we'll go through all of the details, including speaking to their chief engineer Stuart Wood, and I'll tell you absolutely everything that you need to know about it. But first up, a quick review of the lineup. As the entry point, we've got the R model still, and this is the most affordable but with the least flashy spec. Then above that there's the RS, which adds a whole bunch of more performance oriented features that we'll get onto. And then for 2023 specifically, we've got this Moto2 edition, which celebrates the fact that this 765 inline triple is used in that race series. It's also worth noting that there's no longer an S model that got dropped last year, and it used to be their lower powered version that could be made A2 compliant. But the Trident 660 was launched a year or two back, and it pretty much fills that role perfectly and is selling extremely well, so there's absolutely no need for them to double up. But for these new Street Triples, there are 5 key areas in which they've made improvements and really taken it up a notch, and the first one is the engine. Chiefly, there's a 7 PS increase in peak power on the RS model, and naturally that engine is used in the Moto2 edition. But also the slightly less powerful R model still gets a 2 PS bump up to 120, and torque is up across the whole range with 80 Newton meters peak, so that's up from 77 on the R and 79 on the RS. So what changes have they made to bring this improvement in performance?
As you know, our engines are powering Moto2, and that's been a fantastic opportunity for us to develop, understand, and then bring the performance upgrades we've now got for Moto2 into the road bikes as well. The couple of main things we've done is, one, concentrate on flow and efficiency. So we've got new intake ports, new intake trumpets, completely new exhaust system which is free at flowing. On top of that, we've looked at combustion chamber. It's a fully machined combustion chamber and a new piston. We've increased compression ratio, and we've increased combustion pressures as well. Now, when you have those opportunities, then the tuning on top of it brings you the extra performance.
On top of that, they've shortened the gearing and final drive ratios to make it feel a little more snappy. There's an up and down quick shifter as standard and a slip assist clutch on all models. And then there's also a new freer flowing exhaust system which ought to offer a little more bark. Now, they've also sought to improve the bike's handling, making things feel more nimble and agile with a revised geometry.
We've raised the back end on the RS model, so this is partly due to rear suspension unit length and partly due to setup. So we've got a longer shock, courtesy of putting a spacer above the clevis for the rear suspension unit, which jacks the back of the bike up. This increases or reduces actually the steering head angle. As I say, it's partly component changes, but partly setup as well. So we can obviously tune the position on the stroke that we set the front and rear suspension to give the geometry. With the Moto2 edition, we've steepened that headstock angle even further. So that's at 23 degrees. We've now moved to full Olin suspension on the bike with a new setup again, and that allows us to change that angle even further.
Now, all 3 models get fully adjustable suspension, so you can dial them into your exact preference and riding style. And with the R model, you get a Showa 41mm separate function big piston fork up front and a Showa shock at the rear. The RS gets a similar fork but an Olin shock, and then the Moto2 gets a full Olin setup all round with a chunkier 43mm fork. On top of that, you've also got an improvement in the braking hardware.
On the R, we've got the Brembo M432s. Okay, they're really good front calipers and with an adjustable master cylinder. On the RS and on the Moto2 Special Edition, we've got the Stylema calipers. Okay, we've got the MCS span and ratio adjustable master cylinder, but we've also taken the opportunity to tune with pads and piston ratios to give an even nicer feel.
Lastly, on the handling front, you now get Pirelli Diablo Supercorsa SP V3 tires as standard on the RS and Moto2, and they say they'll give you track levels of grip in a fully road legal tire. The R, on the other hand, gets Continental Conti Road tires tyres, which they say are more of a year-round wet and dry type tyre that'll equally stand up to commuting duties as well as quicker road rides. Now, from an ergonomics perspective, there's a new 12mm wider bar on the R and RS, and not only will this affect comfort, but also the handling. Now, the Moto 2 edition gets clip-on bars for a much sportier riding position, so those are 80mm lower and 50mm further forward than the standard bikes, and so of course that's going to feel much more aggressive, although Stuart did say it's not as low and far forward as something like the Daytona. It's also worth taking a moment to appreciate those top yokes specific to this bike and etched with its number, and they're just a thing of absolute beauty that really makes the cockpit feel special. On top of those changes to the bar position, there's also a bit of a lift in seat height on some of the models, probably owing to that suspension change that we just talked about. So while the R is just up by 1mm from 825 to 826, the RS is up by a more significant 11mm, and then the Moto 2 edition is the tallest of the bunch at 839. So it may look like bad news if you're on the short side, but it's worth noting that there's a 28mm lower seat accessory and a 10mm modification to the rear suspension linkage. So combined, that could get the R down to 788 and the RS down to 798, both of which I think are pretty acceptable for a bike of this style. Now, tech also gets a big old buff with a new inertial measurement unit and revised riding modes.
Right, with all of the bikes, we've got corner optimized traction control and braking. Okay, so that's a really nice feature, allows you to brake hard at any angle of lean in corners, and the bike is going to apply the brake or traction if you're accelerating appropriately. Okay, when you choose track mode, you've got a different ABS tune. That ABS tune actually will switch off the corner optimized ABS. It'll allow more wheel slip before intervention, and it'll disable the brake linking. So you have a mode that has almost no intervention. It's there just as a safety net. So you are controlling on a track, which is repeatable, predictable situation. You're controlling your braking precisely the way you want to. Our engine maps are also slightly more aggressive, responsive. So in road, sport and track, you've got a more aggressive throttle than you had previously on top of the increased power. In rain mode, 100 PS and a nice gentle tune for optimum control greasy conditions.
Now, to manage all these settings, we've got a 5-inch full-color TFT display on the RS and Moto 2, and the MyTriumph connectivity system is fitted as standard, which opens up call handling and multimedia as well as turn-by-turn nav. The R model, though, well, that now gets the dash that you'll also find on the Trident and Tiger Sport 660. So an inverted LCD top half for your basic riding info, and then a smaller TFT at the bottom, which can be used to manage the riding modes and settings, as well as be hooked up to the Bluetooth stuff if you get the accessory. At first, it might look like a big step down from the other models, but genuinely, this dash is really very good, especially if you're not too bothered about the connectivity stuff. Now, that brings us on to the looks, which have been sharpened up with a new, more chiseled appearance owing to the new bodywork. So the tank shrouds, radiator cowls, headlight finisher, belly pan, tail section, and silencer all get a new design, and the Moto 2 gets a bunch of carbon just to give it that extra lift in finish. Now, Triumph sometimes get criticized for a lack of vibrancy in their color choices, but there's perhaps a little more jazziness in some of these new models. The R is probably the most muted with just silver or white paint. The RS, though, well, that also comes in the silver, but if you want something more popping, then you can either go for the red or this very vivid yellow. But the most brazen of the bunch, naturally because of its racing associations, would be the Moto 2. This one gets their new Triumph Racing Yellow, which is almost fluorescent, and there's a choice of either an all-out yellow version or the crystal white with the Triumph yellow accents including on the subframe. I really like the look of these bikes, but as always, I'd love to know what you think of them down in the comments below. Now on to the price, and we've got the R at $9,595, the RS at $11,295, and the Moto 2, which will be limited to 765 units in each color choice, comes in at $13,795. For the R, that's an increase of 100 quid on the previous generation, and the RS, it's 300 quid up. Personally, I think you're getting quite a lot of bang for your buck there, so I think it's fair to say it's worth the extra cash. But if you can't afford one, then maybe consider the Trident. It gets a lot of the same triple character, but at a much more accessible price point. And if you're struggling to choose between the two, I've got a comparison of the Street Triple and the Trident, and you can watch it by clicking right here.